All right, welcome everybody. Um, my name is Angela Lee. I am the Vice President of PTCMW, and I'm happy to kick off our last event of the year. So before we get this event started, I wanted to open with some general announcements for PTCMW. So first off, for this presentation, everybody has been muted, and so please stay on mute until the Q&A session at the end of the hour. Also, this presentation is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be posted on the website for members to access after the presentation. So looking forward for PTCMW, we plan to continue doing virtual events for the foreseeable future until maybe things change. So stay tuned for next year's updates. And just a quick recap of our past events. We had a great turnout for the fall event last month. Thank you to everybody who attended. It was a great virtual modification. And so, so that went really well. And looking forward, following our recent tradition, January's event in 2021 will be an address from the past president. So Emily Tyson will be giving a presentation in January, so stay tuned for event details on that. Also, the PTCMW elections are ongoing. So if you haven't already, please make sure to cast your ballots and vote by December 16th. And finally, the mentorship program is also still going on. We're about halfway through, and thank you to all the mentors and mentees participating in that. All right, so those are all the general announcements for PTCMW, and so now I'd like to turn to today's presentation. I'm very happy to present two very accomplished speakers from DDI. They will be giving an exciting talk entitled Leadership in Context, Shifting Conditions and Changing Demands. And they'll present preliminary findings from the 2020 Global Leadership Forecast. And so our two speakers today are Dr. Doug Reynolds. He's an Executive Vice President at DDI, and Stephanie Neal, who is a Director for the Center of Analytics and Behavioral Research. And so their bios were included in the event details, so I just like to share some fun facts about Doug and Stephanie. So Doug actually started his career at Humro in Alexandria, Virginia, and so that's why he's still a PTCMW member. So Doug, we thank you for your continued participation and support. And before Humro, Doug worked a variety of weird, odd jobs. These are his words. So some of his jobs include a bartender in a bowling alley, maintenance crew at a power plant, and real estate salesperson. Among other jobs he will rarely mention in public, but maybe he will talk about them during the networking session after this. And Stephanie, she has lived and worked in DC twice. So the first time was as an intern at the World Bank, and the second time was for her first job out of grad school at AAMC. And so again, I just want to remind everybody that the session is being recorded, and this recording and a PDF of the slides will be posted on the website for members to access afterward. All right, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Doug to kick off the presentation.
Thank you very much, Angela. Let's do a quick sound and video check before I just launch in here. Am I still sharing my screens? Can you see my title screen? Great.
I can, yep.
And my voice is coming through okay?
Sounds good.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let me give you a little background on this topic then, see if we get things moving. I've spent a fair portion of my career as an IO psychologist designing and creating programs to help leaders in organizations. These are usually assessment programs to identify, hire, and promote leaders, or development programs to help them grow and be more effective. As an IO psychologist, I have to admit to feeling some frustration about the degree to which theories about what makes for a good leader have been helpful in the practice that I do every day, building assessments and building development solutions. They're useful, but I find that they fall short in some critical areas. One of the things is that they often fail to describe the effect that the environment around the leader is having on the demands on those leaders. So the quotes that I'm starting off with today, I picked just to reflect the fact that often what affects leader effectiveness isn't a feature of the leader's personality, but how they react to the situations that surround them. So this notion of how context affects leaders and leadership is the core of what Stephanie and I wanted to talk about today. So here's today's agenda, just a little plan for our talk. We're going to start off saying a little bit about the role of context in leadership, and I'll tell you a bit more about what I mean when I say context and how we work with it in our work at DDI. This is a practice-focused presentation. I'll make a few comments about research, and we have some data to share. But a lot of this is coming from examples that we pull as we think about how context affects our work, in the hope that those examples will help others also to think about how context can affect leadership. As we go through, I'll give some examples from our work, as well as a more recent massive shift in context that you might guess at. And we've got some data to speak to that coming from the Global Leadership Forecast that Stephanie will talk about. Steph and her team spent a lot of time doing some massive surveys on what is affecting leadership. So we're going to be pulling some data from that. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions and implications along the way. To give you a little context to where we're coming from, just a quick summary of DDI if you don't know us well. We are in the 50th year of operation as an IO psychology-based consulting firm. We have 3 lines of business that you see there: leadership assessment, development, and executive services that kind of combine the two, assessment and development. A few years ago, if you watch the consulting market, you might know that we sold part of our business, and that was the entry-level testing and hiring business that we used to do. That was just a portion of our business. We sold that to generate strategic focus and to kind of double down on the leadership space. So right now, DDI is really focused on consulting around leadership in all regards: assessment, development, and at the executive level. We've got about 1,600 active clients at any given point in time. We operate in 26 countries. And about half of our revenue comes from outside of North America. Our biggest growth in recent years has been in Asia. It's one of our biggest non-US offices. And we have a decent sized presence in Europe as well. If I were to summarize the way DDI approaches the consulting market, I would say that we are a product-based consultancy. We've got a range of products to support the assessment and development of leaders, and our consultants customize and configure those to meet business needs. That's really where DDI is coming from, and the examples that we pull will be coming from those operations. So back to context. So what do we mean by context? Let's start by just grounding the conversation. I'm not sure I've been to a presentation at SIOP, and I'm sure there've been some, but I haven't been to one that's strictly about the context for leadership. So I didn't have a lot of models to pull from, but I did have some research. So let's start there. A few years ago, Dick Jenneret, well-known practicing IO psychologist, made a grant to the SIOP Foundation because he spent a good portion of his career working with senior leaders in the assessment and development space. And he felt like we needed to focus more on the research and connections between research and practice and what makes for great senior leadership and how is that practice played out in IO psychology. So they gathered about 40 researchers, and I had the pleasure of being part of this group to have a 2-day symposium to look at the state of the research and practice on senior leaders. And that work was summarized in a paper I had the pleasure to work on with Cindy McCauley and Suzanne Sukumis, another PTC member. By the way, that paper is going to be linked on the PTC site and is open access. Because of Dick Generet's generosity, we were able to pay for that to be open access. Anyhow, the one of the bottom lines of many was that the role of context in leadership is an underappreciated variable when you're trying to understand what makes leaders effective. There's a lot of research and theory looking at the role of individual leader traits and skills, how they interact with their followers, the maturity of their team, but less often does the role of context play out. So that really got me thinking about this and is the origin of this talk. Because when you're practicing in the area of leadership assessment and development, the role of context is a pretty dominant factor. Yeah, our customers are likely to bring it up pretty quickly. When they're looking at our products, they'll often say, well, how does that apply to what our leaders are going through and what we need to do as an organization? So I think most practicing IO psychologists are used to having to bend what is in the theoretical literature to how it plays out in practice. And when we think about context, a lot of it comes up in that way as we're trying to match what our customers' environments are like. So more specifically, the experience I bring to the table is probably coming more from an assessment center design context. And DDI was founded using that assessment approach. Our founder, Bill Byam, brought the assessment center method from AT&T into the business community and built the start of the business, at least. We still do assessment centers, but it's just a portion of what we do. But he brought that into application in the business environment. And at the heart of a good assessment center is the simulation of real life aspects of work. So the use of simulations is always a component of assessment centers. And it puts a lot of weight on realism. You see some of the photographs I pasted at the bottom of the slide, going back to the old OSS precursor to the CIA versions of the assessment center, where they had people doing field exercises and rated their effectiveness. We still use these principles of mapping into context when we're designing automated simulations to replicate the leader's work. It's always been a part of that, but it's always also been treated sort of like the artistic side of assessment. And if it's discussed at all, it's often discussed in the sort of the guise of face validity. And we know our customers care about that, but what is face validity really, and why does it matter? So there's some reasons why context and might matter deeply. There's some research that goes back to the mid-90s where the paper looked at the effect of putting the phrase "at work" at the end of personality items. So they used the Neal, and they did some experiments and validity studies using items that had the questions, like "I'm always courteous to others," and then it would say "at work." And just making that minor modification raised the validity in some cases as much as 20 points in the correlation scale. So minor adaptation to context had a pretty significant practical effect. But when we're working at it, we're looking at certainly far more than just putting "at work" at the end of our personality statements. We're trying to replicate larger contexts, and you can see the kinds of variables that we're working on listed here on the screen. But that's in the assessment context. Really, the question we want to approach is, how do you understand the environment and what matters to leaders so you can capture the right things and build it into the assessment in the first place? So to understand context the way I'm talking about it, you need to focus on 3 levels of analysis. A lot of times IO psychologists will start at the person level. They'll start by looking at the leader, talk to the leader and that person's peers and boss, to find out, what do they need to do? What makes for a good one? if you go outside of that and look at organizational and environmental factors, you might get a somewhat different picture. And we started doing that, I would say, routinely about 15 years ago in our assessment practice. And we'd often start with questions about what does the organization need to do to succeed in their environment? What does it need to survive, to grow, to be profitable? A lot of times, these are the kinds of things that show up in strategic statements. Not always, but most of the senior leaders will be able to tell you what are those things that the organization has to accomplish. And then by knowing that, you can start to filter that down into the requirements for leaders. What then do the leaders need to do in order to accomplish those objectives? One of the things we didn't expect to find, but as we did more and more of those interviews, we found that those questions resulted in answers that fell into about 30 different themes. So we started looking systematically at the competencies that would relate to those organizational objectives. And I'll give you a couple examples. So the green squares here are some of the organizational objectives that would often fall out of those kinds of conversations. What does the organization need to achieve? And then we could map that into our job analyses to see, well, what are the kinds of competencies that tend to show up in job analyses that support those business objectives? And we, again, would find some consistent patterns that would play out and be supported by senior leaders. And here's just a few examples. Some organizations have to drive efficiency, and that might be a blend of competencies like driving execution, leading change, and making good decisions. A different one might be increasing revenue, where you might also have operational decision making, but mixed with business savvy and customer focus. The point of all this is that the changing organizational demand has an implication for what the leaders need to do. So how do you go about figuring out important aspects of the environment? There's a few ways to go about doing this. At the highest level, we do some environmental analysis. The work I'm about to show actually comes from Steph's team. So this is something that she and her team do and update about once a year at least. And I find this really interesting, but it's probably also the most intuitive. At the broadest level, what's going on in the environment that our organizations operate in, and how is that likely to be translated into organizational objectives? Well, we do that by scanning the literature, and not just business literature, but technology literature is a good place to look, looking at keywords that reoccur. It's not an in-depth literature review. We're doing massive data searches to see what kinds of terms and issues come up repeatedly over time and across industries. We also analyze things like conference programs, what investments are being made in the venture capital environment, and what's happening in influencer networks in social media. And then we look at the relevance. Is it relevant for a few organizations, or is it relevant for many organizations? And the result of this is we come up with a list that looks something like this. I'll build the whole slide here. We will look at what are the things that are showing up as critical in almost every environment. They're mentioned frequently, and they're probably things that most organizations need to be thinking about. That's the left-hand side of this chart. And then what are those environmental things that are coming up and they're important to some organizations, but not most? And then on the far right, you see ideas and things that are starting to emerge. There might be relevant for some parts of the business community, some organizations more so than others. So we can, over time, when you repeat this and look at what topics tend to get traction and what moves from the right side of this chart to the left side of this chart. And we can start watching trends that impact organizations in that way. So that's one way to look at context in the broadest way. And a few years ago, we started doing some work to look specifically at a few of these. And I'm going to pick on just one of them. Digital transformation is the top one. We'll look at that. by the way, you might note some of these are bold because our most recent one was done in the context of the pandemic. We were looking at which ones of these are changing as a result of things happening this year. So you see some of the bold items are the ones with the most recent change. But as a first example, let's get into digital transformation and tell you a little bit about what we found as we dug into what leaders think about digital transformation and how that might be shifting the demands. There's a lot written about digital transformation in the popular business press. If you go into the academic literature, you'll find a little. Here's a study out of MIT. I think they did one recently too that extends this, but this was from 2017, looking at the features of organizations that are most likely to succeed with their digital transformation. Digital transformation is, certainly about technology. It's automating business process and whatnot. But the thing that they're focused on, and what we tend to be more focused on, is not the technical part of it, but the human side of it. So from a human organizational leadership perspective, what's different in organizations that succeed in the digital environment? Well, they tend to have characteristics like the right side of this chart and less like the left side. They're less hierarchical, they're more team focused. They're a little bit more cross-functional. When they're allowed to be in their offices, they use more open, flexible space than segregated physical space. And they're able to adapt quickly. They respond quickly to changing environments. So that's some of the things that are shown in the literature for organizations that are good at this. So use that as a foundation. But we also looked at another data set. We're going to look at this data set a couple of different ways in this talk today. I'm going to start with this is a massive survey. It's actually multiple surveys that ask leaders about what's affecting their jobs, but also there's a separate parallel survey that goes to HR leaders and executives that talk about characteristics of their company and what they're trying to excel at. We know what companies they're from, so we can do some interesting analysis, but I feel out of my domain talking about the specifics because Stephanie, your team does this. Is there anything you want to comment about the sample that we had in 2018 in particular?
Yeah, I think this really summarizes it well. Thanks, Doug. And really the important point is just to say this is really a massive survey, and I appreciate that you called it the two perspectives. We get both the organizational or HR perspective and the leader's perspective, which allows us to really dig in to what's happening in organizations, how things are changing for leaders and for business. So I think this is a great example. I know we'll talk a little bit more about this year's study later too, to get into some of the details of where we landed this year.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that. But digging into this sample from 2018, let me give you an example of how we looked at this facet of digital transformation as a context variable for leaders. I apologize, there's a lot on this slide. If we'll get you the link to the full set of results. But the important thing here is just the column with all the stars in it. And I'll tell you what that says is we looked first at the HR survey to see which variables or which companies rather the HR data suggested were prioritizing digital transformation as a priority and were good at it. They were experiencing success. So we pulled that from the HR survey, and then we looked at the leader survey to figure out if that condition was correlated with certain leader characteristics. They said that they were confident and skilled in certain areas. Did the probability that a leader said, yeah, I feel good about this competency relate to organizational performance as rated by that other group? The ones that are starred here are the ones that made a difference when the leaders had confidence in those skills. Those were the discriminating ones between the groups that the HR team said were great at digital transformation versus not so good. So those are the differentiating characteristics. We also had some data that indicated whether or not HR thought that their leaders were actually good at that. That's the far right column. So the point here, though, is that organizations perceive to be a little bit better at digital transformation. You go into the leader deck, and the leaders are saying, yeah, there's certain skills that they focus on more than others that might address that context. Next, we looked at financial performance. So we looked at a 5-year financial growth measure and how that related to some of those digital skills that we just identified. And what we found was the organizations with higher ratings on those digital capabilities tended to outperform their peers from a financial perspective, knowing that digital transformation is a critical driver of success in a lot of these businesses. So there's some evidence that, yeah, if the leaders could do it well, they're focusing on those competencies, the organization makes it a priority, it leads to business success. And we dug into that just a little bit deeper to say, well, what is it that's going on in those organizations that would lead to digital success? And we found these kinds of cultural characteristics were rated highly. They tend to be very experimental. They've got cultures that tolerate failure. As many of us know, technology doesn't always work. So experimenting and putting technology in the heart of your business is something that you've got to have a flexible mindset for that. And that's part of what we're seeing here. The point of all this comes back to a diagram like this. So if you're trying to transform digitally, you're trying to do things like shift the organizational paradigm and drive product innovation. So those would be examples of frequently occurring business objectives. And then the competencies behind that could shift towards things like the ones that you see in the blue boxes to support that. So the chain that we're looking for is organizational or environmental change leads to organizational priorities that have shifting demands then for the leaders. So the next example I'd like to get into is something that I think we're all familiar with and feeling. So we have right now at play a massive context shift. Worst global pandemic in 100 years. I don't think I have to belabor the point that has implications for organizations and potentially for leaders. And can we use some of the same data sources to see how that would play out? Just a quick look at the obvious. I think we've all lived through curves that look like this, and it almost doesn't matter what variable I put up here. Almost any economic measure that's been tracked over the past year tends to have a dip like the one that you see in these graphs. As the number of cases went up, the confidence went down, and unemployment went up, and organizational performance declined. I think at a personal level, here's some data from a survey that was done on, remote work. And this one's probably pretty obvious given the fact that a lot of us are on this call from remote work locations. I used to be in that light blue bar on the left-hand side, almost never working remotely. And on March 13th, I quickly jumped over to the blue bar on the right. I haven't seen the inside of my office since the 13th of March. Now I'm over in this group, and that's true for the modal respondents to the survey. So the environment's changed pretty dramatically. I think we all know that. And what are the implications? So we can hypothesize the fact that some things might have changed, but can we look and see if these changes are playing out in the way that leaders are facing their jobs? So back to the leadership forecast, and I'm going to turn the reins over to Stephanie at this point, because it just so happened we were in data collection when the pandemic hit. So we were able to use that as a variable to look at. And Stephanie, if you grab the slides for me, we'll see if this works.
I'm going to request control. Hopefully it'll let me take over here too, Doug, but let me know if there's any delay for the rest of you. So yeah, as Doug pointed out, I'm really excited to talk about what's unique about this forecast and what we're seeing in our 2021 GLF, because there were some really unique conditions, of course, around it. And just to show you some of this by the numbers, you can see here the number of responses that we got to our 2021 GLF, and we're calling it that because it does come out in 2021. So you're all getting a bit of a sneak preview today. But you can see in the center of the ring, the number of leaders and organizations and HR professionals that responded to this survey, and clearly large numbers. We survey both HR and leaders throughout the globe as part of the forecast. And the percentages on the outside of the ring show the breakdown of just leaders. So you can see the composition of the 15,000 plus leaders who responded to the survey this year. Just to give you some example of what really the composition represents, you can see in the top right the percentage of leaders that responded from different levels of their organizations, from first level managers all the way up to C-suite. This also shows the global and industry representation, which Doug highlighted on the slide earlier from the 2018 forecast. And because we have such large samples of leaders and organizations from all these different areas and backgrounds, what's great is it allows us to dig deeper and do some comparisons at the group level, within a certain industry, looking at generational or geographic trends. And that's something that we'll continue to dig into and share out as a part of our larger leadership forecast series. But as I mentioned today, we're going to give you a sneak peek of some of the data that's not been seen before and go into some of the findings and trends that we really want to share with you related to context. But before I do that, I just want to quickly highlight what's really changed in terms of the timeline this time. And I'll see if it lets me advance the slide, Doug. If it doesn't, I might have to ask you.
Yeah, there might be
There's a little delay. Yep, sometimes I click between my monitors. So just to show you, obviously survey data collection launched, and this was in planning for really 2 years, launched at the beginning of February. So we never could have anticipated what took place this year, as none of us could. And it got much more interesting in terms of trying to get the responses that we wanted to for the survey. But the good news is that because we were gathering data before the pandemic was declared and before most of the world and leaders felt the impact of COVID-19, we really had a strong base of responses across all these 3 points in time, with more than 500 HR and nearly 3,000 leader responses before the pandemic hit, and even more responses after March 15th and after the initial crisis response, which allows us to really get a unique glimpse into how organizations and leaders were responding and how they endured through the crisis. So that's some of the content we want to highlight with you all today. And I'm going to call it some of the bigger changes and shifts that we saw, including how the pandemic amplified some trends that were already taking place, how it impacted leaders in their day-to-day lives. And I think this will help to demonstrate, the impact of these circumstances for leaders and organizations and what we might want to take into account as a result. Let's see if it lets me advance again. Sorry, Doug, it seems like there's a delay every time I click back. Okay, let me know if I'm ever not keeping up with the slides here. So just to show you, one of the first big shifts that we saw was just in terms of the time that leaders were spending. And we saw some interesting things about leaders' responses to more than 20 items about their current leadership experiences and how they spend their time. For one, we saw that leaders spent more time at work in response to COVID-19. So on average, leaders reported that they spent over an additional hour on work after March 15th. Before the pandemic, leaders reported that they were spending about 9.8 hours each day on work. And keep in mind, this is a global sample. But at the onset and peak of the crisis, we saw that average tick up to about 10.7 hours. And you can see a breakdown here in this chart of how the core activities really fell out as a percentage of leaders' workday on average. So for the most part, there really wasn't a significant shift in the proportion of time that we were spending. Things like spending time in meetings was pretty consistent. There were just a couple of slight changes, like a small drop in the time they spent on emails, and that could be due to leaders using more chat or different communication tools as a result of that shift to remote work. There was also a slight uptick in the amount of time leaders spent meeting one-on-one with members of their team right at the onset of the crisis. So we thought that was interesting. Could be that they had to kind of spend committed time and talk to their team one-on-one and have some more difficult conversations. And they were also spending more time dedicated to work as we saw kind of the onset of the crisis. But still, if you look, overall, you can see between the three different columns, there aren't really significant or surprising changes given the context, but we did see one big change that I'd like to share a little bit more about. And that's here in terms of the amount of time that leaders were spending on their learning and development amidst the COVID-19 crisis. So before March 15th, leaders reported spending just under four hours a week on their learning and development. That's indicated on the blue line. And they said that they would like to spend nearly twice that much, as you can see in the orange line, up to 7.3 hours on average if they could. After the COVID crisis was declared a global pandemic, we saw a significant bump from March 15th to May 15th, where leaders were now spending about 5.6 hours learning a week and wanting to spend up to 9 hours per week. So nearly, 50% increase, nearly double again, what they were actually spending. And what this means is that we found on average with leaders reporting they were spending about 50% more time on learning and development than they did before the pandemic. This was also significantly more time than what they spent after May 15th, once things started to settle into a new normal. So this is just one find that shows, something really did change during that onset of crisis, and leaders had to respond to it, probably felt like they needed to learn more. And we're packaged this into a GLF trends infographic on our website that I think we're going to share the link out for, but I still want to just show you how this looks. So you can see the layout there. And really this infographic highlights not only that time shift I just showed you in the other chart. I wanted to call it out because this also shows another big way that leaders changed in how they were learning and spending their time. So that first, you can see the bubbles in the middle of the graphic here, is that leaders spent more time on their learning and development, which on average, as we saw, was about 2 hours more each week during the onset of crisis. We also saw that how leaders were learning really changed. Not only did leaders spend more time learning online, but we saw their preference for it increased pretty dramatically during this forecast, as you can see in the chart in the upper right corner. When we asked leaders how they most preferred to learn, not just how they were actually learning at the time, if they preferred to learn online or offline, we saw that only 28% of leaders before the pandemic indicated that they preferred to learn online. After May 15th, and you can even see as the onset of crisis, it started to tick up. But after May 15th, this increased to 40% of leaders wanting to prefer learning online. And this is a level of change we don't typically see in the forecast. We've been running this study for 20 years, and this is just something that typically doesn't change this much over the course of our survey collection. So this really demonstrated how much the pandemic accelerated changes, maybe some that were already happening and starting to learn more virtually, but really showed this strong shift to virtual learning. We also saw some significant changes in how leaders experience challenges at work. So I want to get into some of those for you as well. And you can see here that COVID-19 really tested leaders' skills. This is a second snapshot of one of the sets of findings in our infographic that summarizes several changes we saw in terms of leadership skills over the course of the pandemic being declared, and also with that initial crisis response. Of course, one being that the importance of digital acumen peaked 25% higher after March 15th and the pandemic was declared. We found that globally, a higher percentage of leaders said they also had to be prepared for two other business challenges: responding to the competitive environment in their industry and also innovating to improve products and services, which are shown in those yellow arrows. So that's actually the percentage increase we saw in leaders reporting that. And in the context of the pandemic, we also saw that leaders faced new challenges in their day-to-day roles, having to have more difficult conversations, leading remote teams for the first time in most cases. We're behind some of those standout changes. And you can see leaders as a result actually started rating that they were less effective in leading virtual teams and in using empathy. And this wasn't just at the onset of the pandemic, it actually was throughout our whole data collection. So we continued to see a decrease and saw leaders' ratings continue to drop off over the course of the spring and into the summer. Doug, is there anything you'd want to add or comment on here?
Well, I can just kind of give you my own personal perspective, having been in an environment that was rapidly changing at that time. When I saw these findings, I resonated with the 78 and the 61 that you see on the left in particular. DDI at its heart is a business that is running, or a year ago was running up on a majority of its revenue coming from the deployment of in-person events, in-person assessment, in-person development programs. And to have that change in a matter of weeks to zero, you could really feel the pressure to say, well, who's better prepared for this than us? What are they doing? How do we shift, what was a small portion of our business that is digitally supported to having all of it be digitally supported? So the pressure at that time was enormous as a leader. And yeah, you are thinking about what's happening competitively, but you're also thinking about what you need to change. And we talked about business pivot so many times that our president said we were not allowed to use the word anymore. He was tired of hearing it. But it was at the heart of what we had to do to improve and change very quickly. And I think that's why you see the innovation popping up the way it did. It was interesting to see this on a bigger scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that's very real, and we saw in so many different organizations having experienced this, and also leaders, of course, feeling firsthand the effects. So that's a great call out. I'm just going to go to next. We did see also some shifts in terms of leaders. There we go. Oh, I went one too far. In terms of the demands of leaders and businesses, we really saw at the onset of the pandemic that also drove leaders' responsiveness to management challenges differently. As you can see in the chart here, one of the biggest changes we saw was that the percentage of leaders who indicated leveraging new technologies for their business was one of their top challenges, peaked significantly during that period in the middle from March 15th to May 15th. There was also an increase for rallying their teams around a common purpose, building team enthusiasm and engagement, which reflects how many leaders were working to bring their teams together at the time. We also saw a bump for holding employees accountable for results and for gaining stakeholder support, which might reflect a shift in the focus of critical priorities that just had to be driven at the time. And of course, we know not all challenges can go up. There were some reverse trends as well. So just to show you some of these, you can see there were a few slight drops, kind of the opposite trend that we were just looking at, with the biggest drops reported by leaders for making change happen. And that actually continued to drop off after May 15th as well. This is one will be interesting for us to continue to track over time. It might reflect, of course, that there's so much change happening already. Leaders were responding more to the changes they already had to confront rather than driving new changes. We also saw drops in areas that leaders likely felt were less outside of their control or less needed, including the need to make hiring decisions, likely because there were freezes in hiring and layoffs for many organizations. And this, along with navigating organizational politics, are just overall the two lowest rated areas and management challenges for leaders. And they typically do say this is where they're least confident that they can excel. So it's possible the pandemic just drove these down a little bit further. Doug, is there anything you'd want to call out here or add to this?
I don't know. It sort of felt like you kind of try to get rid of the non-essentials. Obviously, you're not doing a lot of hiring. Organizational politics, the making change happen. I sort of thought of that as some pre-planned change effort is probably going to get derailed when everything else is changing outside of your control. So those things that are more pre-planned, I could see dropping off. That's how I understood that trend.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, clearly seeing that there were shifts like this just shows how much the pandemic had an impact on leaders and organizations. And really, we wanted to explore this a bit further, especially with this forecast, because we had, data at these different points in time. And also because we gather perspectives from both HR and leaders, we were just curious to see what made the difference for organizations and leaders that fared better through the crisis. And in particular, we wanted to see, were there any leaders' attributes or strengths that helped organizations to perform better? So wanted to share at least one result of some of the analysis that we've done so far, kind of hot off the press. What we found is that leaders' competence really drove how well organizations were prepared to succeed in some areas critical, always, but especially during the pandemic. And we looked at, in terms of leaders' preparedness and success, for two contexts in particular: digital readiness, which we've already seen became, pretty significantly more important to leaders, and preventing employee burnout, which was also an area many organizations had struggled and continue to struggle. So specifically, we looked at how the aggregate of leaders' competencies, that is how strong they were as a leadership group in several skills and clusters, contribute to organizational outcomes ratings from the HR survey. What you see here is a visualization of the results of some regression analyses that we ran to identify the relative weight of leadership competence in the areas on the left. So in that first column, you can see that's the impact or contribution to digital readiness. And in the right column, the contribution to preventing employee burnout. So you can see clearly some standout areas just in the size of the bubbles in this plot, where organizations with leaders who were stronger in leading virtual teams, digital acumen, leading change and empathy contributed much more significantly to their overall digital readiness. And results were a bit more spread out for preventing employee burnout, but you can see a few different competencies stood out: empathy, coaching and delegation, and influence being the top 3 contributors for preventing employee burnout. So just wanted to call out, obviously between the two, you can start to see some patterns, but we actually looked across all the business challenges that we cover, and it's really, quite a set of about 10 different business challenges. What stood out the most, and this shows us, not just for 2 contexts, but across all, is that when more of an organization's leadership population is ready or strong in areas that will get called upon in a particular time or for a particular business challenge, they're far more likely to be prepared and likely to succeed. We also saw that some skills that contribute most significantly to success across all business challenges, which is the list of 5 you see here. At the top of the list was leading virtual teams. And this is something that stood out, really during this time. I think likely because it's, something that a lot of leaders weren't prepared to do. A lot of leaders hadn't experienced leading virtually before. And just to reflect that, this is also an area that just 1 in 5 leaders feel that they are strong. So it was really a clear differentiator across all the different challenges. There were also some core skills, including coaching, delegation, and empathy, that showed their importance really, consistently, and just foundational skills. Digital acumen was a significant predictor, not only for digital readiness, but also for driving innovation and responding to the competitive environment, and probably not surprisingly considering the context of the pandemic. So all 5 of these are areas that contributed most to how prepared organizations were to succeed, across business challenges, which showed us that they were really a critical and foundational set of skills for organizations at this time. So I wanted to show you how this really showed up in terms of how prepared leaders felt. And you can see in this slide the number of competencies, I skipped on the wrong one. Let me go back for you here. Sorry about that. I will skip back a couple.
There you go.
And can you see it okay now? I didn't give anybody, hopefully, any vertigo. Falling through this so quickly. There were some clear trends in how effective leaders feel they are in these areas based on whether or not they've been developed. What we saw was most often leaders aren't being developed for critical challenges. So you can see in the blue bars what percentage of leaders felt they were effective in these skills. And this is overall across all points in time of what we studied this time. And then, what percentage felt they were developed is in blue, and what percentage felt they were effective in yellow. And what stands out is that fewer than half of leaders feel they're effective in most of these skills. So clearly that's already showing, there's definitely room for improvement. But in particular, very few felt that they were effective in those 5 skills that we just looked at and highlighted as being the strongest contributors across business challenges. And those are noted here by the orange dots you see on the slide. So you can see especially the 2 at the bottom of the list, digital acumen and leading virtual teams. We can see that only about 1 in 3 leaders feel they're very effective in these areas. And these aren't areas that most organizations are developing their leaders in any formal way either, which could be, it's also, more of something they need an experience to do. But it could also be that it's just a missed or hidden opportunity, depending on how you look at it. Doug, is there anything you'd want to add here before we go on to the conclusions?
No, let's just conclude and get some questions going, so we can always come
Great.
back.
I will pass it back to you then.
Okay. Is that all you need to do? Do I have it back?
I hope so. If not, I'll
Yes, I
click
do.
and try not to rapidly
Okay.
click for you.
So what does all that mean? Going back to our key question about context. So we looked at it a few ways, and we tried to show, in our practice, how does the role of context play out, and what do we do to go about assessing it, and what's the evidence that changes in context can actually change the impact on leaders. So from an environmental perspective, probably the no big surprise, there's massive change in the environment that shifted things to operate more virtually, heightened focus on competition because business is getting tougher, and a drive towards innovation are some of the things that we saw very broadly. When you look more specifically at leaders, there's some interesting things. So yeah, of course they have to be able to figure out how to lead virtually, but they've also got to figure out how to change the way that their function or organization provides value to the customer, because the way they used to do it may not apply anymore. We saw a continuing important role for coaching and empathy. And I thought that this was really interesting that although their workload has increased, the time on the job is increasing, their concern for building their own skills also increased. Usually you get the response like, well, I don't have time for development, I got so much else going on. But here you actually see they're craving development, they're reaching out for it in whatever way they can get it, despite that increased workload. So if I were to read into it a little bit, I would say that the massive shift in context started pulling on skills differently, and they felt the need to prepare themselves better than they were to address the changing circumstances. That's my take on it. So, and then to put this in the assessment and development context, going back to this sort of notation, there's a few organizational objectives that are likely to come up in this environment: turning the organization around, making sure it survives, engaging employees, avoiding burnout. They're likely to pull on skills differently than they did in the past. Now, I'm sure, did the job of leadership really change in the midst of all this? That's kind of at the heart of this question. And, I think if you went out and asked people a question, what makes for a good leader in your organization, across a wide variety of contexts, you're probably going to get similar results that we always get. They need to define vision and communicate it. They need to engage employees. They need to set a clear strategy. Those probably wouldn't shift that much. But at another level, the changes in context can really start to pull on the blend and mix of other competencies that are going to be required for them to be successful in their work. And the extent to which organizations have leaders that are more prepared, the better they seem to fare in these contextual shifts. So just to wrap up here, what do we do with all this? I won't go through all these. I think there's a few that are worth talking about it. I think this is an opportunity for those of us that work in the HR talent management community to help to translate environmental change into changes in demands for leaders and help our organizations be prepared. It's interesting that a lot of the themes we're seeing, you hear this a lot, that the pandemic just sped things up. And I think that's kind of true here too. We were tracking digital skills several years ago, and they were prominent this time. So organizations that were better prepared for that, when it accelerated, there they were able to take advantage of it. The focus on some basic people skills is important. So when you're thinking about what to prioritize in your organization, I think looking at these future trends like digital, but also some of the basics, it's an important mix to have there. So I think from our perspective as practitioners, the how you think about context and bring it in it's more than face validity. To some extent, it forms probably a bigger portion of the variance in what leads to senior leadership success if they're able to predict and prepare for the kinds of skills they're going to need. That's the sort of treatment of context that we use, and I'd be interested in others' thoughts on how how the variables play out in your environment. But maybe end on that note and see if there's some questions to clarify.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug and Stephanie. We do have a question, at least in the chat right now, and I'm going to turn to that in a second while I'm talking. If you have additional questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. And the way we're going to handle this is I'll tee up the question, and then we will unmute you. And so, Gary, you're going to be up. Prepare yourself. And you can have a little bit of back and forth if you want it. And if you don't, then no pressure to actually say anything. But the first question we do have is from Gary on the line, and it's for Stephanie. And this is in relation to one of your slides, Stephanie. So if you want to, it's the one in relation to the amount of time that's being spent with the learning and all of that, and the differences in time. But the question itself is, do you think the difference in time spent on work could be a result of having extra time because no time is spent commuting to work for most leaders? So the total time spent working and commuting combined may have remained stable. And
Yeah,
Gary,
great. Oh, can you hear me okay?
I can, and I'm just going to unmute Gary. That way, if he wants to have dialogue, you guys can have dialogue.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, this is a great question. I think that is a very good point that definitely leaders did find themselves some additional time in most cases, probably, especially since I imagine most were working in person before the pandemic hit. So I would say that's, definitely a clear hypothesis. I think we do also see just that the uptick in activities, increased in a few places. So likely they were just spending more time to get work done may have been the big benefit they earned with a lack of a commute, amongst other things, saving on some money, I'm sure as well. But you can see, in these 3 bars, there weren't huge shifts in terms of where they were accounting for their time. This is something, if we had, put the survey together, knowing the pandemic was going to happen, we probably would have asked a couple of other choice questions to dig into that more, but likely we're going to follow up and do a pulse survey with leaders. So that might be something specifically we ask too. So I love that you brought that up. Gary, did that help answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I appreciate it. Yeah. I mean, I think there's only so many hours in the day. So
Absolutely.
you can spend them commuting or working.
Exactly. So benefit, that's something I think probably a hidden benefit for organizations is they got a little bit more time, focus time from people out of this as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question.
I didn't see any other questions come through the chat. Does anyone else on the line have one? You can just plop your name in the chat as well, and I'm happy to unmute you and let you have some dialogue. And while we're waiting, I'm curious, as Steph and Doug, is there anything out of the survey that you haven't talked about yet that you're really excited about, or that has the potential to be very impactful for employers? And
yeah, actually, we haven't put it all out there yet. We gave you a sneak peek, but there are some things we're really excited that are going to be coming out in the main report in February. But one, just to highlight, one interesting shift is that people became much more positive about leader quality overall. So not just their own leadership, but the leaders at their organization throughout the forecast. There's a sneak peek of that in the infographic that we teased as well. I know you're going to get the link for, but amazingly, HR did not feel the same way. So we're going to talk about that. There was a dramatic uptick, leaders feeling more positive, but HR wasn't as impressed and actually was more critical of leaders. So just that mismatch this time was really interesting. We've always seen, it's not totally aligned, but this year there's some different things happening. So we'll definitely be talking more about that. Anything else, Doug, that you feel like stood out?
Yeah, you're closer to the data. I'll go with your response. I do see a new question from Michelle. Yes. Maybe I'll jump on that one and you can figure out how to unmute her while I'm answering.
Yeah, and there's a follow-up to it. So I'll read it out loud, and then we can let Michael pop in here. But the question is, aside from large annual surveys and such, and the literature review, what are some recommended methods and means to collect data on environment and organizational context variables within an organization when building an assessment and development program? And then there are some examples in the follow-up, anything different from standard job analytic methods, such as focus groups, interviews, and job analysis surveys.
Yeah, Michael, I was going to say one thing before I saw your follow-up, but I think I'll still say it. I think go back to where this started for us is because our executive practice typically starts with conversations at very senior levels, not only about organizational strategy, but why your strategy is what it is. So I guess that falls in the category of an interview, but it's different than a typical job analytic interview, and it's best with the senior people in the organization. So so we're looking at things like what is your environment? What's your strategy likely to be next year? What are the variables you're tracking now? Yeah, definitely want to find out what your strategy is, but how things are changing. So that's the context that the senior leaders are worried about, and it's the information that we use to narrow down on what was I was putting as those green boxes of organizational priorities, because they're the things that have the biggest impact on leaders. So other than the surveys that we presented, I would say that that's the main thing that we do, but I wouldn't say it's standardized. There's room for some innovation there.
Thank you.
So this next one's from Heather. Given there was a significant increase in leaders wanting to have more learning conducted in the online environment, you see rich media simulations similar to what's used in assessment centers being developed for training and coaching. I definitely think so. We're spending some of our R&D money on exactly that sort of thing, but that's not exactly new either. But I do think the push towards online is likely to mean that there's going to be more investment there. One of the things that we had been experimenting with, and we think this is going to be big, although not yet, is the inclusion of virtual reality as a way to improve that that context connection. And we were having some really good success with that, and it was becoming popular. But I think as much as people are shifting to online, they're definitely not shifting to putting somebody else's mask on their face. So we took a little pause in that one, but I think this is a place where we'll see virtual reality come back and have an impact.
Thank you. Great. Does anyone else have any last questions before we transition to our networking event? All right. Well, if you do have a question, hold on to it, because Doug and Stephanie are going to join us, and you'll may be randomly assigned to a room with them. Well, Doug and Stephanie, I want to thank you so much for joining us and participating. This was a great presentation, and I'm excited to see what's going to come out